attendees now. Got folks trickling in. So for those of you who are joining us, we ask that you use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're coming from today, the organization that you represent, and we'd love to know if you managed to get outside this last weekend. If so, where you did that. My name's Christian Beckwith. I'm the Executive Director of SHIP. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Jackson, Wyoming that advances the health benefits of time outside. And with our Health and Nature webinar series, we're exploring the health and nature movement from the perspective of our various stakeholder groups. So today's episode is the last episode in the conservation chapter. And it examines, the chapter overall examines the ways that nature as a public health strategy can create an implicit argument for nature itself. Upcoming chapters will feature presentations from the perspectives of land management and outdoor recreation. And all of this is in the lead up to Shift in October, and will take place October 14th to the 16th. It'll be broadcast virtually this year for reasons we're all familiar with. And we're looking forward to having you as part of that as well. So stay tuned for more details on that. I would obviously like to thank our sponsors, National Park Service and All Trails. My background is our own Grand Teton National Park here in the northwest corner of Wyoming, something that we enjoy very much. And All Trails is the way that we enjoy it. So if you're not familiar with them, they're an app that lets you map out any of the routes in places like Grand Teton National Park that you would like. You can share it with friends. You can see user reviews. It's a great tool to have in your quiver if you, like us, love to get outside. So we do encourage you to use that. And with that, we're jumping into today's episode, Conservation, COVID-19, and the New Civil Rights Movement. And with us today, we've got three distinguished guests. We have Shatiba Bradley, Project Manager with the Greening Youth Foundation, Angelo Azilo, the founder and CEO of the Greening Youth Foundation, and Fearn, Professor of Practice at North Carolina State University. This presentation is being recorded for later distribution on our Slack channel, which you can find at Shift Nature Health, and on our YouTube channel as well. Following the panel discussion, there will be a Q&A session, so use that little Q&A avatar at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for the panelists, please post them in the Q&A section and we'll get to them in about 30 minutes or so. So today's episode has a look at some of the issues that have been really highlighted over the course of the past couple of months in particular. And we're so excited to have Angelou and Shatiba with the Greening Youth Foundation as part of this discussion, and of course, Fearn as well. Shatiba Bradley, MBA, is the Greening Youth Foundation's project manager. She oversees the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Directorate Fellows Program and the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Intersects program. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology and a master's degree in business administration from South Carolina State University, where a chance encounter with a park ranger led her down a career path as an interpretive park ranger for the National Park Service. She's also worked as a training specialist in fire and aviation and on a Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Joining the Greening Youth Foundation has allowed her to continue to inspire people of color to take the path less traveled in life through choosing careers in conservation. Angelo Azilo is the founder and CEO of the Greening Youth Foundation, and following a brief, fortunately for us, stint in practicing law, she embarked upon a career as an environmentalist. Working as a legal specialist for the New Jersey State Agriculture and Development Committee. As a project manager for the Trust for Public Land, she realized the disconnect between the land that was being preserved and the education of people about that preservation, particularly as it related to our next generation. This was the impetus for the Greening Youth Foundation, which provides environmental access to underserved children and young adults throughout the country, as well as in West Africa. So thank you, Angelo and Shatiba, for joining us. And we also have with us Fearn. Mickey has been a public servant, parks, recreation, and conservation professional for over 50 years, serving as National Park Service's Deputy Director from 2008 to 2013. With the City of Seattle, he served as Director of Innovation, the Executive Director of the Neighborhood Leadership Program, and Director of Communication and Citizen Engagement. He also led the Mayor's Initiative to End Racism and Create Equity in the City of Seattle. He served as the Washington State Parks and Recreation Commissioner for 12 years and worked for the Governor of California and the California Department of Parks and Recreation as Community Outreach Specialist. He's currently a professor of practice in North Carolina State University School of Natural Resources. We are honored to have Mickey on our board at SHIP as well, and we're so delighted that the three of you could make the time to join us for this very important conversation. So we're going to start this conversation with you, Mickey. You've got a few more years under your belt than some of the rest of us. And we just wanted to know about some of the historic challenges that you encountered to getting people from communities of color into conservation and land management agencies when you began your career with the National Park Service.
Well, it started a little earlier than that. When I graduated from college, from California State University, Sacramento, in Parks and Recreation Administration, my first job, the California State Parks Director asked me to do a statewide survey about why Black people didn't go camping and hiking. I might say I've been in Parks and Recreation work for 54 years and in conservation work for about 40 years. But so he had me do a survey to find out, what the deal was between people of color and nature. When I interviewed to be the Deputy Director of the National Park Service, the question that the Secretary of Interior asked me was, what are you going to do to get more people camping and hiking? And so in that span between 1970 and between 2009, obviously we didn't solve this problem. And that's one of the things I'm really concerned about. I'm really concerned about the fact that we've been working on this I've been working on this since 1970. And I think of all the millions of dollars that have been spent, and fundamentally, we're in the same place in terms of the condition of people of color in urban areas, and in terms of people of color engaged in the conservation movement, that there's been no movement. So that's what I'm looking at right now. How is it that all that time has passed and there's been no change? In 1965, Lyndon Johnson, after the Watts riots in 1965, Lyndon Johnson convened the Kerner Commission to look at what happened with the Watts riots. And they said, undeniably, the Watts riots were a product of racism, a product of a bunch of social maladies that exist in those communities. And if we don't solve those things, that we'll continue to have these problems. So I want to share with you what those things were. He said in Watts, and of course the riot was precipitated by a police event, and there was looting and there was robbing and all that stuff. But the Kerner report said, here are the things we need to fix if we're going to solve this problem. High unemployment, underemployment, low incomes and poverty, psychic residue, high school dropout rates, neglect, low educational attainment, health issues, poor environmental quality, family instability, high rates of delinquency, substandard housing, displacement, unresponsive government services, and that people of color had an unrealistic reliance on government as the primary source of employment. So if you hear those things that I just said, you'll notice that those things still exist today, right? Exactly the same things exist today. So how could we have stated that so clearly in 1968? When Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore in police custody, Time magazine came up to do an investigation about Baltimore. And what they did is they took their 1968 cover, crossed it out, and put 2015, right? Wow. Because basically nothing has changed. So I'm asking myself, why, as it relates to conservation, we've been working on this all this time, and we've been working on urban issues, and those things are very directly related. What is it? Why is it hadn't changed? And by the way, it's not about Republicans or Democrats, because Democrats have been in power through a lot of that time, but nobody seems to have figured out what the problem is. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to look back at this stuff and see what is it that keeps progress from being made. And I want to share a couple of those things with you. One is that we mistake planning and discussion for progress. Bureaucracy, the magnetic pull of the homeostatic state. The National Park Service, and I was there, and I think it was the best mission and vision organization I've ever worked in, but the pull of the homeostatic state, the pull of how the National Park Service is, literally keeps change from occurring. Picasso said, for every act of creativity, there's an act of destruction, and we're more likely to focus on the destruction than the possibility. And so that's certainly been the case. Whenever you get ready to change some, you're going to destroy the form it was in to create a new form, but people will always focus on the destruction, not the possibility, which keeps change from happening. Failure to let go of rituals, information, and concepts that keep us from entertaining new possibilities. There are tons of rituals in the National Park Service. There are tons of common practices that create the homeostatic state. And in fact, those rituals and those policies and those common practices keep things from changing, but nobody changes that. We try to use outdated ideas and concepts in the creation of new possibilities. It's easier to blame victims than to create systems that eliminate the victimization. Those who stand to lose resources, power, control, because of the change, will try to stop the change. Anybody who perceives that they're gonna lose flexibility, power, or resources as a result of the change will stop the change. We implement mechanical and structural solutions to problems that are dynamic, and we fail to realize that the process of creating new possibilities is a product of an in itself. So I want to talk a little about what I think our challenges are. I believe a huge challenge is to create alignment between our lifestyles and our environment, regardless of who we are. There's some of this stuff that's just basically human nature, and some of this that's specifically related to racism in American society. But I think one of our challenges is to encourage alignment between our lifestyles and our environment. Create a society that has no need for an environmental community. In other words, you create a society where everybody in the society is an environmental steward. So you don't need an environmental community. Part of the struggle we've had is the environmental community has been primarily white, right? And so we haven't looked to create that environmental ethic in everybody. So we need to create a society in which there's no need for an environmental community. We need to ensure that environmental justice has the same status and attention as conservation. And this is a fundamental belief of mine. I got to be at the March on Washington when I was 16 years old and to listen to Martin Luther King give the speech. One of the things I saw after that speech is the people who heard that speech all got serious about civil rights. It didn't matter who was there, but when he gave that speech, that's what propelled the civil rights movement. Other than Emmett Till in 1955, that's what propelled the civil rights movement. My feeling is somehow if the environmental justice movement and the conservation movement can come together, and they're in violent agreement with each other, both groups want safe, healthy, sustainable environments in which we can work and play. Both are in violent agreement with each other, but they won't talk to each other. The conservationists tend to think that the environmental justice people are myopic and they're only concerned about those things that happen in their neighborhood. And I've heard environmental justice people say, and I'm not taking a political position, I'm making a quote, that they consider conservationists to be like Republicans, that they could really care less about the conditions that they're living in. Now, in my zip code in the city of Raleigh, I live in a zip code 27610, the lifespan is 13 years less than a zip code 5 miles away. Lifespan, I'm gonna live 13 years less as a result of living in this zip code, and most of the causes are environmental justice issues. Environmental justice probably causes more mortality and morbidity than any other single thing in those areas, but those communities haven't acknowledged that, and the people who could solve the problems haven't acknowledged that. So if the environmental justice movement and the conservation movement come together, it becomes a very powerful movement. What we have to do is we have to create conversations, because the conservation people have the resources and the money and the power, and they could be instrumental in dealing with the environmental justice issues. And as we fix the environmental justice issues, we have people who are suffering from those issues beginning to understand conservation. All right. I think we need to create a situation where everybody sees their indigenous environment as habitat, not just as the place you live. Your habitat is supposed to satisfy your need for food and work and a bunch of other things, but I think we just look at housing as housing. We don't look at the areas that people live in as habitat, and therefore we haven't committed to making sure that that habitat is healthy. We have to understand how groups of people who had a strong ancestral relationship with nature had that relationship disrupted. When the secretary said, "What are you going to do to get more people camping and hiking?" my response is, this is hyperbole. I don't care nothing about camping and hiking. I do care about camping and hiking, but this is a part of the story. What I want to know is how a group of people had a profound ancestral relationship with nature in their indigenous environment, in their ancestral environment, who were brought to this country because of that understanding of nature, have had that relationship with nature totally disrupted. What is it that disrupted that relationship? I don't care if people go camping and hiking. What I want to understand is how, at least in African American urban communities, people are saying there's nothing good that happens out there in nature. You don't want to go there, you don't want to be there. It's not fun, it's not educational. So I want to know how that happened. And we cannot fix this problem until we grapple with how that occurred. We have to accept that environmental education and outdoor recreation alone will not solve this problem. So my primary issue is a bunch of things haven't changed. And if things don't change, it's sometimes because people don't have the will. The National Park Service has great words about what they call relevancy, diversity, and inclusion. Sierra Club has great words. The Nature Conservancy, the Trust for Public Lands, the other federal agencies, they got great intellectual language about what it is we should be doing, yet we don't see any change occurring within those organizations. So the question becomes, what are the fundamental steps we need to take in order to be able to do that? I think the people at the webinar are kind of lucky today because we have Angelou and a nonprofit who's been working on this for a long time. We have Shatiba, who is recently a part of the experience, going through the trials and tribulations of that. And of course, I have my 54 years of experience in terms of looking at this. So, and then Angelou's book, and I want to suggest that you all read it. It is the white fragility of the conservation movement. So,
thanks for that plug, Mickey.
Well, so most of the people who write about this spend all their time describing the problem. I don't know how many people have described what's wrong with the National Park Service or what's wrong with the conservation movement. But in those efforts, when they describe it, they never come up with any solutions to it. And Angelou's book does have some solutions, and I think we need to scale those solutions up. So I'm going to stop. My primary point is that unless we get the conservation movement and the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement together, we'll have a very difficult time solving this problem. Thank you.
Mickey, thanks as always. Your insights have been so helpful to us as an organization and to the movement overall. And Angelou, thanks so much for joining us and for the work that you're doing. And I'm just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how Greening Youth Foundation addresses some of the challenges that Mickey so eloquently just articulated.
Yeah, I could see why we should be calling him Professor Fearn for sure. He definitely dropped some knowledge there. There's so much, I mean, there's so much to unpack. And as Mickey said, like, you know, you can look back to 1965 and just cross out that report and put in the year 2020. And my thing that keeps coming to me is, are we all insane? You know, because we're doing the same things and expecting a different result. We have to stop that. So my background, as you said, I'm a trained attorney, but also wanted to, once I learned about the outdoors and saw that there was the ability to have careers in this space, I wanted in, but once I got in within the Trust for Public Land and, all these different land conservation organizations and saw so few people that looked like me, I knew that there's something needed to change. And my favorite saying is actually a quote by Angela Davis that says, "I no longer accept the things that I cannot change, but change the things that I can't accept." So that to me sums up what Greener Youth Foundation, why it came into being, because I think in this environmental space, there's an access equity issue. There's a power, like when you talk about the convergence of COVID and the new civil rights movement and conservation, I think that those intersecting points is power, economics, and access to equity. Access equity. There's so many people, I'm sure Shatiba will elaborate on this, so many people of color that aren't aware of the career pathways that exist within this field. I certainly I wasn't aware, and everything that I was exposed to as a child, and my character traits, everything should have shown my parents and others that this is someone who enjoys the outdoors. She should be guided towards a career in conservation or the outdoors, what have you. But because of the way I looked, the mere fact that I was a brown girl made two things, made my parents uncomfortable with guiding me in that direction. And they didn't feel it was necessarily safe, nor was there any counselor or anyone within the schools that I attended that guided me that way. So my whole, the reason for Greener Youth Foundation, as well as the reason for writing Engage, Connect, Protect, was to show that there's so many young people of color, and that's BIPOC, and as you said, Mickey, people of color, whether it's African, Native American, African American, Latinx, like there's this deep spiritual symbiotic relationship with land, and there's no way, like when I first got into this work, working for the Trust for Public Land, I would often hear, well, we would have more people of color working here or working on this project if they were interested in the environment. So I knew it was like ding, ding, ding. Like I've grown up with parents always talking about land and how rich and important, our ancestors ate from land, the land healed them. There was this relationship. So how is it that now seems to be this deficit of people of color wanting to recreate and work in the environmental sector? I call bullshit. And that's what I did basically. So, I wanted folks to know, and that's what the book was for. I wanted to disclose that myth and just kind of, bring light to the fact that there are so many of people that are working in these fields that look just like us on this call right now. And that it's important to provide those on-ramps. So the access equity issue that I talk about, I didn't know that careers exist in this field because there were no internship opportunities that I was exposed to going to Spelman College, no less. So I think it's important to show young people, it's like a continuum, show them really young and introduce them to the environment and to these conservation career pathways so that we're planting that seed at a very young age so that when they get older, they're thinking about, even if they don't pursue a career in the environmental sector, whatever career they do, we know that they'll be doing it with the lens of sustainability and stewardship. So, we do that with our Green Box Forever Green Kids environmental programming, but we also have paid internship opportunities because, everyone often wants to say, why do we have to pay these young people? Why is it essential that these internships are paid? And I always push back on that and say, it's because we need to make sure fundamental needs are met in getting these young people interested in this field. I wish we can say that we didn't have 400 years plus of systemic and institutional racism that we're still having to deal with, and is why we're looking at high unemployment numbers, education issues, poverty, all of that is plaguing communities of color. So how do we go from that to saying, oh yeah, and by the way, they need to volunteer to do these different jobs in the outdoor sector. So that's why it's really important for us to say they need to be paid, you know, so that they can get into the field, not think about these basic needs, and actually explore whether this is something that they want to pursue. And then lastly, you know, our internship program is for college students, but we realized that there was a huge swath within our population of young people that weren't interested in college for whatever reason, whether they couldn't afford it, whether they weren't interested because they wanted to do something with their hands, or they wanted a trade or a skill. And that's when our Urban Youth Corps program was born. And that's providing young people college age, but with the trade or skill in the outdoor sector, so that, you know, we can provide, you know, their trades and certifications and all the tools that they need to succeed. So I will stop there, but you know, the main thing is I like to engage in discussions about solutions. You know, yes, we can talk about all the problems that exist, but as Mickey said, we've been talking about this ad nauseum. I'm really ready to put action behind these words, action behind these performative statements that are out there about being in solidarity with the Black Lives Movement and all of that. Let's do the action. Let's do the work. That's what I'm ready to do.
Thank you, Angelo. It's always so great to get your perspective. And one of the things I've admired about you so much is you look around when you see a problem. If you don't find a solution, you make it up yourself. It's always so great to see. And Shatiba, you know, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about your personal journey into conservation and the National Park Service, some of the agencies that you're working with, and as well, what would have made that journey into those spaces easier for you?
Thank you, Christian. My journey started many years back. I was a college student at South Carolina State, small town of about 5,000 students. And by a chance encounter, I wandered into the career development department. And there was a gentleman standing there with gray and green on. I was fascinated by his hat. And he told me the story that he was an alumni and he wanted to come back to recruit at South Carolina State. So that journey led me to the Great Smokies, and I was a seasonal there. And of course, I would tell the story of the Native Americans and biodiversity and all the stories of the settlers who came there to settle in the Great Smokies. So my story started there, but it didn't end. I continued on to other national parks and, of course, found my way to Greening Youth. So my story of conservation really started with a love of biology. I didn't know if I wanted to go the medical route or maybe environmental science, but I knew I loved the great outdoors. So I grew up with horses. I grew up around a lot of agriculture. So I knew that there was something in me that desired to work in the great outdoors, but I never knew what that looked like. I never knew an ecologist. I never knew a land manager. I never knew a lot of these things existed. So my generation was coming out of the time frame when you had to go to law school or you had to go to medical school. My mom always tells me her options were teaching or nursing. So, you know, we are evolving as in career paths, but we still have a long way to go. So I feel like, you know, as you asked, the last question was, what would have made my pathway different? And I believe organizations like Greening Youth, Hispanic Access, these organizations who are not just giving students employment, but also giving them that pathway, as Angelo has said, of how to connect the dots and go to the next level, not just hiring students, but hopefully creating stewards and creating future leaders. So that was my journey. And of course, along the way, there are always people put in my path that would tell me, you should try this. Have you heard of Pathways program? Have you heard of SCEP? But as a whole, as a system, there was never something in place that would capture people who were working season after season, year after year. And maybe there were systems in place, but it didn't capture people who looked like me. So I was invested in the story, but my story was never told because I felt like there wasn't an interest. I was just someone who was there to work those seasons. And of course, we spoke about this earlier, those seasons vary. You know, I worked in many national parks. Some could be May through August. Some may be the winter months. But if you were really invested in that story, you really want to go and tell the story for Paul Revere or for Dr. Martin Luther King. So very vast network of parks. But what I hope for the Park Service and other agencies is that they would buy into the student and hopefully build these leaders. We know there's a silver tsunami that's coming where there's an emergence of retirees that's coming out of the system. We want that 17% of people of color who sit in these positions of the National Park Service to hopefully increase those numbers. We want diverse numbers. We don't want just entry-level GS4s and 5s. We want to build future land managers who can fill that void that we know that's coming and is actually here. So that's kind of the road where my journey started. And of course, as it continued, I always wanted to work in the nonprofit sector. Something wasn't data-driven, something that wasn't funds-driven, something that we really can make a difference. So my journey came to Green and Youth, and I found my way of looking for people who look like me and actually kind of creating those pathways. You know, we have those systems in place where not just like, as Angelo has said, not just employing students, but also can go in and mentor those students, provide those professional development opportunities. And all while, you know, speaking to them with the shoes that I've came in. So I've walked those shoes, walked the roads, many miles that the students are walking. And many of those are HBCU students. So not only do they look like this, but we are very intentional with, you know, we want a diverse workforce. You know, we want women. Many of the spaces that I worked in, such as fire and aviation, it wasn't about race, it was more just gender. So I was a training specialist for the National Park Service. I would go out to wildfires. I would go out, I was red carded, I was gray carded, so I would go out to all hazard, and we could expand and contract based on the complexity of the incident. But no matter where I was at, whether it was the Deepwater Horizon oil spill for over 100 days, whether it was in Northern California, Southern California, New Mexico, Oregon, one thing that I noticed is that I was always alone. So we talk about that when we speak to our interns, is how do we bridge that gap? And, you know, and we've teamed up with the university to kind of fill those gaps to see what is the disconnect? Why aren't there more people of color and diverse backgrounds, including gender? Why are we getting those students out in the great outdoors? So that's kind of the role I play. As Mickey said, we've had a lot of people put money and resources into the jargon and the legislation on why, but we're on the other end of the table. As Angelo said, we're trying to bridge those gaps and have answers, not just keep throwing questions in the fire. So that's kind of where I started and my legacy and what I would like it to look like of helping students and help Green Youth and other conservation organizations kind of continue the movement, as Mickey said. So the civil rights, of course, the people rights, we're still moving forward. But we know there's a lot of work to be done when we see percents, such as 17% of color. That's not even a population if we couldn't compare the ratio of the number of African Americans in this country. So I feel like we want those numbers to be proportionate of what the population shows. And of course, if I had the answer, of course, I wouldn't be here. So I know it's not an easy fix, but that's kind of what I've seen in my years. And hopefully that, you know, we will see that change. And as I see what works as Green and Youth is doing, we do see those change, and we can track data and we can track analytics because we know why those numbers are the way they are.
That's great, Shatiba. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and your journey with us. We've got way more questions that we developed in advance of the webinar that we have time for, and we're starting to get some great ones in the Q&A. So I just want to wrap up the conversation between us and then open it up to some of the audience questions to make sure that we're getting their perspectives and their queries to you as well. And Angelou and Mickey, you know, we've talked a lot about how so many of the issues that the Kerner Commission report identified remain true today. I'm curious where you're seeing the sort of positive change that we're hoping to see. Where are you hopeful? Where are the trends moving in the right direction?
Well, want me to start, Mickey?
Sure.
I'm hopeful because of the young people that we engage every day. So as Shatiba said, like she runs HBCUI, Historically Black College and University Internship Program. We do work with Hispanic serving institutions as well as tribal colleges. And when one of our land management agency partners presents us with a program opportunity, when we put out the position description to our population, our network of young people, we are flooded with young people responding to that ad or to that job opportunity. Literally, if we put out an ad for one internship, we'll get hundreds, 400 to 500 that respond, that are qualified young people. So I'm hopeful because I know that they're out there. Like now that it's almost like the cat's out of the bag. Now that they've been exposed to this career pathway and these options and these opportunities that exist, they're all over it and they're wondering why they haven't even heard about it, and why aren't there more. So I'm hopeful because I know that they're not going to stop. I know that they're not going to say, oh, because this agency or this company or this environmental nonprofit is not letting us in, I guess that means we won't be able to do any work in the environment. No, that's not the response. These young people are fired up, and if they can't get a spot within these organizations, they're creating their own. And to me, entrepreneurialism is a big part of this. So, Mickey, to us he helps to ensure that we don't repeat the past, in our quest to move this forward. He informs us of what things we might need to change to move it forward. And, I'm just so thankful to have mentors and people like Mickey and Audrey and Frank Peterman and all those type folks that really are there for us, and we're on their shoulders. They are advising us and telling us how to move this forward. And, if we provide, then there's a next generation, there's Shatibas and, the Danielles and the Jose Gonzalez, all of them that are right there, right behind, younger. So it's over now, like if you want to remain relevant as an environmental org, then you need to make sure you have people of color as part of your leadership team, period.
Thank you, Angelo. Mickey, what do you got for us?
Okay, you're assuming that I'm hopeful. You're assuming I'm hopeful, and I am. But if I'm hopeful because of work that people like RUMAP and Angelou and Jose Gonzalez and the work people are doing on the front line of this. The tech industry is doing this thing called putting out minimally viable products, and that's products that they know aren't quite right, but then the market will correct them. But they just don't sit around talking about it intellectually in their heads about how to change the product. They actually put it out there, and that gives them an opportunity both to make progress and to learn something. And I think that's what Greening Youth and Outdoor Afro and Latino Outdoors and a number of other organizations that are not coming to mind right now are doing that. The problem is those organizations are having trouble getting funded, right? Those organizations are on the front line, creating threshold experiences, creating educational experiences, organizing communities with no resources. Whereas you have the conservation community, both the government agencies and the nonprofits with a lot of money and a lot of power, and they seem to be doing things that don't make a difference. And that's why I'm saying again, that there needs to be collaboration. There's a futurist named Marshall Mcluhan, who I met a long time ago. I actually got to meet him personally. And he was talking about why things don't change. And he said, part of the reason things don't change is because solutions don't exist in disciplines, they exist in the spaces between the disciplines. In other words, the National Park Service is never going to solve this problem. The Forest Service is not going to solve the problem. Sierra Club is not going to. But when the National Park Service works with Angelou, and Angelou works with Atlanta Parks and Recreation, and Atlanta Parks and Recreation works with the kids in Atlanta, and we create threshold experiences and pathways, that's what's going to make the difference. But I remember, when I was in the National Park Service, we were doing some work in Portland, and they said, well, what we need to do in order to reach this population is to hire community organizers. I'm saying that's not our line of business. Community organization is not our line of business, right? There is somebody in Portland who's doing community organizing, and we need to find out who they are and where they are, and we need to give them the resources they need in order to get the population together. There are a couple other things that concern me. I've learned in life both as a husband, as a father, as a worker, that you can't solve a problem until you realize you're part of the problem you're trying to solve. There's no way you can solve a problem until you realize you're part of the problem you're trying to solve. And the conservation organizations and the national and all of those people have not really grappled with the fact that they are the problem. They keep trying to fix us. They keep trying to fix us to avoid fixing themselves. So I think the key to it is to create these partnerships where everybody's involved, that create these threshold experiences that result in more people on a pathway who are able to take these jobs. And by the way, and we have to look at not only about people taking jobs, but about people engaging in this recreationally. Both of those things are important. And the conservation community is not for everybody, but nature is.
Yeah.
Nature is. And so there are three things we all need. As a recreation person, what people often say to me, if people decide that they don't want to go to nature, that's their business. It's their free time. They can do whatever they want to do. But it's not that simple. The reality is there are three things that we all need. One is to stay in touch with our creative spirit, to stay in touch with each other, love and kinship, and then contact with nature, which is a basic need. Contact with nature is a basic need. It's not a recreation alternative. And those three things are connected. Creativity, nature, and love and kinship are all connected. And so we just have to start on some new journeys to try to get to that.
That's great. So we've got a bunch of questions coming in. And so I hesitate to ask this, but Shatiba, before we jump into some of the Q&A, I'm just curious what you envision the conservation space looking like in 50 years, and the sort of work that you're doing now, how that can help us get there.
I wish that's something we could all do, and it would be such an easy answer. Sometimes I wonder if that's going to be a bleak. What will it look like in 50 years? You know, we're 50 years out from the Clean Air Act, and we still know we don't have clean air. You know, we talk about the Clean Water Act of 1970, and we still have people that don't have clean water. So I would like to be optimistic and say in 50 years, we will have a diverse workforce. We will have investment in communities of color. But when we're speaking about conservation and what does that look like in the workforce, I would hope to see more women. You know, we're a lot of people like Angelou and like Map and many other greats that came in this conservation movement, but that's just one of few. So I would want to see this movement grow to the point where we can reference 10 to 15 names, not one or two that's on the ground doing work with young people. And not just workforce development, but recreating. You know, we know people of color like to go out in the great outdoors, but is there inclusiveness? You know, we know there are many stories that you've seen over the news about what people do when they go outside and have a picnic in a public space and what happens. So I would like to at the end, you know, but that's not an easy fix. So what does conservation look like in 50 years? I think it will be inclusive, but I think there's a lot of I's that need to be dotted and T's need to be crossed. For the workforce, I would love to see, you know, I referenced that number 17%. I would like to see those numbers proportionate to what we see in our community. You know, I would want to see people of color in leadership roles with all major agencies, and actively recruitment in historical Black colleges, historical Hispanic colleges, and also Indian tribal colleges. So we want to be the change we want to see in the world. But I believe that starts with home. So what is home? Green and Youth is home, and that's what we're doing. But we want to see those conservation movements grow, no different from other organizations have done. So that's kind of what I see. I would love professional development. We want to invest in the youth. We believe that the youth literally is what's going to take us to the next 50 years. Baby boomers are coming out, and Generation X and Generation Y, those are our future leaders. So if we don't invest in tech and technology, professional development, and communities, there won't be another 50 years. So we realize that's where we have to put our funds, our intellect, and our resources. And that's my opinion. But I feel like that's, if we don't invest in those 3 different or 4 attributes, there won't be another 50 years. We should not be talking about Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act 50 years out and still have citizens that are protesting because they have brown water coming out of their tap. So I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic, but we still have some things at home that we have to take care of before we can even go into where will we be in 50 years.
Hey, Christian, can I thank you so much, Shatiba, but Christian, can I add one thing to Shatiba's vision for 50 years of what might need to happen? I think we, and Mickey may have touched on it, but the environmental community is so polarized right now. We have the conservation community on one side, and then we have EJ, environmental justice community, on a totally opposite side. There has to be a bringing together of those two communities to move this forward. You know, I can't tell you how many times, and I come from a conservation background. I did land conservation for the Trust for Public Land, but I can't tell you how many times when someone sees me and they hear I'm doing environmental work, they assume that it's just environmental justice because of the way I look. So as you said, Mickey, we have to get people to acknowledge that they are, the conservation people, community perhaps is the problem that we're trying to solve. The environmental justice community, perhaps if they're staying in this corner, perhaps is part of that. We have to bring those two worlds together. And
what you find out in my experience and in my career and personally is you have to begin to look at yourself. As I said earlier, you can't solve a problem until you realize you're a part of the problem you're trying to solve. I believe the conservation people are very sincere. I believe they have an intellectual and a moral commitment to this. I believe they absolutely do. What we lack is people coming together to understand how much more progress we can make if, in fact, we do this all together. The reality is, one of the things that happens in poor urban areas is that there's this thing called reductionism, that people's career objectives and their recreation interests are based on the things that they see every day, are based on the things that they come in contact with every day. Now, every now and then, some weird person like Angelou or Tiba or me.
Wait, did you just call me weird?
Yeah, I did. And the reason I'm saying that is because everybody I know, every African-American person I know who's involved in this movement is engaged in it because something strange happened to them.
Yeah,
Not because it's a normal career progression.
Right, no, I hear you.
Something happened, some transformation trigger happened that got them in it, but in fact, there's not that career path to it. The other thing that I want to say really quickly is, Kristen, you know that my favorite documentary film is The Biggest Little Farm, right? And it says that the only way the world maintains its balance is diversity, order, randomness, chaos, and adaptability. The reality is, we talk about diversity like it's optional. Diversity is. The planet cannot exist without diversity. There's no way this planet can exist without diversity. And I remember saying to people at the National Park Service, you understand that there's nothing more incompetent than a single species forest? And they go, yeah. And I said, well, what we got in the National Park Service is a single species forest, right? We got 90% white people. We got a single species forest, and there's no way this organization is going to come up with the solutions we need to come up with, because this system serves the people who created the system.
Boy, we could keep going on this all day. Mickey, you've been working on it 50 years so far. I commend you on your tenacity. I do want to make sure we get to some of these questions.
Yes.
We have them here. We've got Dr. Kathy Wolf from the University of Washington. She will be part of next week's webinar episode on ParkRx. And she asks how we can direct attention to parks, nature, conservation, equity, access in the face of so many socio-political needs right now.
Well, I'd say this: when you look at the fact that environmental issues, as I said earlier, contribute more to mortality and morbidity than any other single cause. But in most major cities, when they do research about the concerns that poor people of color have. It's about police, it's about education, it's about jobs, it's about those things. But what's killing them is the environment. But they don't seem to realize that the environment is the problem. But as I said, environmental injustice contributes to more mortality and morbidity than any single cause in an urban area. So how do we get these communities to understand that they're dying at the hands of the police, but not at the rates that they're dying from environmental justice? So a part of our challenge is to get into communities and begin to transform the thinking of those communities in terms of the importance of environment and nature, which is something that we really haven't done, right? So I'd say that's how we have to look at it.
And I would just add that it's a great question, you know, because people, and that's kind of part of that eternal stereotype that people of color are not interested in environment, and that other part is people of color don't have the time to be interested in the environment because they have all these other fundamental issues and needs that they need to address. The way I usually respond to that is stressing the importance of intersectionality. You know, it's important because of the 400 years of, you know, this racist system that we've lived in. It's important when we're thinking about different communities of color to understand that perhaps you're not just approaching it straight on and talking about, you know, food sovereignty, you know, like, so in other words, there's so many issues like unemployment, you know, poverty, hunger, all of that exist, but perhaps in how you approach that issue, that topic in environmentalism, may be couched with the understanding that these communities have a history of, you know, disproportionate impact and effect by these different things. So, you know, if you're wanting to talk about gardens and clean food, you know, understand that communities of color, particularly Black people, have histories of hypertension and diabetes and all of that. So that to me is a segue into talking about the importance of healthy eating in gardens, is by talking about the health and the health issues that perpetuate themselves in these communities. You talk for us in talking about, you know, if you're wanting to get to jobs and workforce within the environmental sector, we know that that's always something that communities of color are needing because of underemployment and unemployment rates being so high. So that's what we do at Greener Youth Foundation a lot. And I know Maite, Hispanic Access Foundation, you know, Outdoor Afro, you know, when they're going on, you know, these incredible epic hikes, you know, they're intertwining history and, you know, communalism and all that kind of stuff, because they know that there's a healing that needs to take place because of the background that we have as people of color. So that, I know that's a long way of saying it, but I would say intersectionality has to be the approach because there are so many issues impacting communities of color.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So intersectionality and collaboration.
Yes.
Both of those things have to happen.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's something that Mickey's really been focusing on, I think, with our work here at Shift, as we try to create these spaces for the conversations and the work to occur in places in between.
Yeah.
And we've got a question here from Mike Hill, and he says, look, if the National Park Service doesn't have the will and the conservation organizations don't have the will, who does have the will?
What do you mean the will? Like
the will to make these changes, to invest in changes.
That's what we're seeing, is that there are organizations popping up. There are within these organizations people who we believe are embracing change and are open to change. So, you know, there's when Mickey was with the Park Service, or George McDonald, or Merlene Masick within the Forest Service. Like, so we know that those champions are embedded within these organizations, because that's how our programs are being, you know, pushed forward and are able to sustain themselves, is because of those people, you know. So I think within these organizations, there's always one or two. And, I know that's yet another burden to have to find that one person within that big organization, but typically they find us. I think you would agree, Shatiba, probably you, Mickey, as well, that, in doing this work, we're finding that those who are interested in change and understand that we can't keep going at this pace because it's not sustainable, and that want to remain relevant given the high number of diversity and brown people that are, in society now. They understand that they gotta get on board, get on board or step to the side. That's what I say.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Linda Fraley, and she asked, any starter info for a small organization? Specifically, this is for you, Angelo. We're sponsoring an internship. We have 14 staff. So how would you advise her to be this change that we want to see?
Yeah, I would definitely say thank you for that question, Linda. Making sure your leadership team, has people of color, internship programs. Like, you want to make sure, when we say that diversity is so critical for everything, species, is so true for businesses. By not having diverse people on your staff or even at that leadership level, it ensures that by having them, it makes sure that you don't have these blind spots that you will definitely have if you don't have anybody on your team that represents the segment of society that you're trying to reach. And then, as Mickey said, partnerships. There's so many organizations, and in my book, Engage, Connect, Protect, that's one of the things that I wanted to provide, because I'm often hearing organizations say to me, Angelo, I would love to engage more people of color. I just don't know where to find them. So that's one of the things that I wanted to provide in this book, was kind of like a database of environmental organizations led by people of color, these schools, these institutions where, that are people of color, primarily they're HBCUs, tribal colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, and broken down according to the disciplines that align with the environmental movement. So seek out those different resources and align yourself in your community with perhaps someone grassroots that is engaging people of color or the demographic that you're wanting to reach. Partner with them. They're already reaching them and they're already communicating with them. So that maybe there's something you can do quid pro quo if you're a small organization, something that you could provide to them, and then in exchange, they could help you with your blind spots.
Thank you so much, Angelo. There was one question: where can people buy your book directly from you, so you can get that?
Oh, believe it or not, I don't have anymore. You have to go to New Society Publishing or Amazon. But thank you for inquiring. Yeah, go to New Society. They're a really good publisher. They're out of Canada and they're very environmentally conscious. And, so I definitely I would say we should support them as opposed to going straight to Amazon.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question, folks. We do want to flag for your attention the fact that these questions will be placed on Slack at Shift Nature Health following this webinar, so that the conversation can continue. We've got one question from Dr. Terry Horton out of Northwestern, and she mentions Shatiba's comment about the feeling of being alone. She says, how can those of us who are older and whiter help overcome the sense of aloneness while respecting students' privacy?
I think the first step would just to be identify with the fact that it's okay to feel alone. The demographics on this is 18 to 24 are the people who are usually out in these remote places working. I worked in Chiricahua in Arizona, and the only car I would see was literally people across the border. And I would see bobcats, and I felt alone. But of course, we've spoken about this as an organization as maybe a buddy system. So it may not be directly from management because there is an age gap. There's a demographics gap. So I believe sometimes just bridging those internships with 2 people at a time, maybe someone from their same localities, from their same university, and also just talking to the student. I think oftentimes we talk down to people, especially when you're talking about different ages. So if a 65-year-old superintendent is speaking to an 18-year-old from Atlanta, Georgia, there's going to be a disconnect. So sometimes it's just sitting down where you're at in life and just talking to them. We're all human, so there's a basic understanding. But I believe that sometimes that is a negative when you're talking about trying to recruit to remote places people of color. You know, we were talking earlier about doing yoga outside, and one of the things that were brought up is that there were mosquitoes outside. No one wants to get bitten up. But that's all humans. I don't want to be beaten up, and I know, Christian, you don't want to have mosquitoes biting you. So what are those drawbacks when you're trying to recruit a workforce of color in Wyoming? You know, so we get that. We speak to students every day, and they want to know, you know, am I going to be the only person there? And sometimes the answer is yes, but, you know, oftentimes we realize that you're going to have to be alone. So there's not an easy fix to that. That's what we're here for. So we try to bridge those gaps between the site and the supervisor and ourselves to kind of help students transition into the new workforce. So hopefully that answers your question. But I think just a surface, a litmus value, just speaking to the student and just trying to connect wherever you find those connection points would be my advice.
And Christian, can I say one quick thing?
Yes.
So I just want to add that there's a lot of work that we're doing, as Shatiba was just describing, with our young people and getting them ready. But there's nothing worse than getting them ready and then sending them to these different sites and forests and refuges. And the people on the other end are nowhere near ready. And it causes our young people to run and not want to even look back. And they're telling 10 people on the way as they're running, don't ever go there. So this is a time for us to all roll up our sleeves and do this work, you know. So for the land management agency partners and supervisors and all those that are on this call, really, you know, and I also provided my website, you know, because I do coaching and all that, but it's important for us. We actually changed our metrics because initially it was about how many young people are getting jobs. You know, our goal was to change the face of the environmental movement by connecting more young people of color to these career pathways. But then I had to change that metrics with our leadership team because our success should not have been determined by the number of people getting jobs, because it was something out of our control. So we were getting them ready and introducing them, but then there are all these barriers on the other side. So I guess that's where I'm reaching out to all of you out there and saying, it's okay to say you need help, and how do I need to do this moving forward? Because that's the only way that we're going to be able to have this unified voice and move this path forward and move that needle of progress, so that we're not having the same conversation 20 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope we can avoid the definition of insanity in this.
Right.
Angelo, Shatiba, Mickey, thank you so much for being part of this discussion. Obviously, we could continue it all day long. We're looking forward to continuing it at Shift in October. It will be virtual, but we're exploring equity, access, and the mental health benefits of time outside. Sign up for our newsletter to get more details on that. This recording will be available on YouTube, so we should have that posted in the next day or two. The slide deck will go up on Figshare. Again, the questions that were unanswered today will be available on our Slack channel at Shift Nature Health. Upcoming webinars next week, we've got one with Atia Wells, the founder of Bliss Meadows. She is a force of nature. Angelo, if you don't know her, I'm looking forward to introducing you. And Dr. Kathy Wolf and Dr. Robert Zara on ParkRx. And then we also have one coming up on July 28th on the Trails Calculator project that we've been developing over the course of the last year or so. So we hope you can join us for those as well. Thank you to everybody who joined us here today. Be healthy, stay safe out there, and we'll see you outside.